Designing any system in a tabletop role-playing game is an extremely daunting task. Saying that it's complicated doesn't even begin to describe the amount of work that it takes. Within those systems though, there are obviously things that are more or less impactful to your game's overall design, and things that are more or less difficult to create than others. However, there are some things which merge these two interests, those of being incredibly important to the game, but also very difficult to design, and those are the ones that are, arguably at least, the most crucial to get right. Enter the Cantrip. I would argue that these are among the most difficult spells to design and balance in the entire game. Ensuring that any infinitely repeatable mechanic isn't too good or also not good enough is a really tricky balance to strike. Cantrips in 5e were quite a fundamental design shift from previous editions of the game. Cantrips in 3rd edition and 3.5 were comparatively much weaker than they are today. They were also finite, and spellcasters like wizards were capable of casting significantly more spells per day than a wizard in 5th edition, for example. It also wasn't uncommon either in previous editions for wizards or other spellcasters to carry around light ranged weapons like slings in order to keep dealing damage once they burned through all of their available spell slots during a given day. When 5e came around, the designers wanted to address this for any number of reasons. They wanted fewer powerful spells per day, hence the reduction in total spell slots as compared to previous editions. They also wanted 5e to feel less like an inventory management game than it had in the past, and wanted to give spellcasters the ability to continually cast magic and not have to rely on standard weapons like slings to get the job done. Really quick, I'm going to be running a 1D&D one-shot with Colby from D4, Chris from Treant Monk's Temple, and Pack Tactics on Thursday, January 25th, 2024 at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and I'm hoping it can also double as a 5,000 subscriber celebration, so get subbed to help me reach that goal and so you don't miss out. I've also just launched channel memberships, so if you'd like to help support my channel in other ways and get some extra perks in return, hit that join button too. I also want to give a special shout out to my first channel member Julio in the Warrior tier, so thank you, and thanks to all of you for considering it as well. If you also want to come hang out and say hi in my new Discord server as well, I've left a link for that in the description below. While I can understand why there is definitely a subset of people who don't like cantrips and feel that 5e's interpretation of them perpetuated the seemingly never-ending power cycle of the game, and there very well may be some truth to that, I honestly really like the core idea that cantrips brought to 5e. That being that your wizard or your druid or your sorcerer are so well versed in certain low energy spells that they can effectively cast them at will. These spells weren't intended to be incredibly powerful, but rather serviceable. They were designed to do a few things: provide a reliable but not huge damage source through something like a firebolt, provide distractions or shows of force through effects like thaumaturgy and prestidigitation, and to relieve the need for things like torches through the use of light, just to name a few. The core assumption of cantrips was that they existed to ensure that your magic user could always feel magical. An admirable goal that I would argue at least did largely accomplish what it set out to do, but not without some casualties. In any case, regardless of what you think about cantrips, what I wanted to discuss today are the badly designed ones. The ones that miss the mark and actually in some cases might have a negative impact on the game overall. To be clear, I'm not necessarily talking about the very good or the very bad cantrips as usual. I'm talking about the design of the cantrips and the implications that those spells have on the game as a whole. I've actually made an effort to pick cantrips that I feel are poorly designed for a variety of different reasons. It's also probably worth mentioning at this point that all but one of the cantrips that I'm going to be discussing have actually received a rework in the 1D&D Unearthed Arcana so far, but as those are just playtest materials and not officially published, we don't know what the final versions are actually going to look like just yet. The bigger purpose here is to really discuss why these spells are badly designed and why I hope to not see spells that suffer the same flaws as them in the future. There's no particular order to this list, so let's just get started. The first cantrip that I want to talk about is Guidance. This is probably the poster child for badly designed cantrips in the game, as it just punches way above its weight. Guidance costs 1 action, is available to clerics, druids, and artificers, lasts for 1 minute, and requires concentration. The spell text reads, you touch one willing creature. Once, before the spell ends, the target can roll a d4 and add the number rolled to one ability check of its choice. It can roll the die before or after making the ability check. The spell then ends. If it isn't immediately clear why this is so good, let's talk about it. The spell effectively grants a permanent bonus of 1d4 to your party for any ability check. That's really powerful. Bear in mind that an ASI is only a +1. This is that, at worst. There's also no material spell component, and it obviously doesn't cost a spell slot either, so there's effectively nothing stopping you from just walking around and spam casting this thing all day long. In fact, Baldur's Gate 3 essentially assumes that you are, since if you have someone in your party capable of casting guidance, the option to use it just appears on the roll screen every single time. Yes, it does require your concentration, but that's probably more than worth giving up for just one of your party members for the potential bonus that it can provide. Now, obviously not every table is going to do this, but the reality is that they could. The only thing that really stops them from doing this is just deciding that it feels cheesy, or if the DM disallows it at their table for whatever reason. This is precisely why the spell is so poorly designed. It's essentially a default pick for most players, meaning that it effectively reduces your available cantrip pool by 1, and isn't a true choice either. It's so good that not taking it kinda feels silly. It simply confers far too strong of a bonus relative to its cost, and is just so reliable and consistent, which is what's landed it here on this list. It's worth mentioning that the proposed update to the spell, which we saw in 1D&D Playtest 3, turns the spell into a reaction, which is triggered in response to an ally failing an ability check, which essentially fully acknowledges the way that the spell is being used in actual play today. However, the twist that they added is that it can only be cast on a target within 10 feet of yourself, which does effectively make it so it can't be constantly cast all day long, and will apply in more niche scenarios than previously. So while guidance just offered far too much and far too much reliability, the next spell, Resistance, has the exact opposite problem. Resistance is also on the Cleric, Druid, and Artificer lists, also lasts 1 minute, also requires concentration, and reads as follows. You touch one willing creature. Once before the spell ends, the target can roll a d4 and add the number rolled to one saving throw of its choice. It can roll the die before or after making the saving throw, the spell then ends. So while yes, it technically could be spammed all day long in much the same way that guidance can, the return on investment for this one is just not there. Saving throws during exploration are just not all that common of a situation to encounter. Of course it does happen, and if you know that you're in a situation where it might be happening, then casting the spell can be helpful, but they're just so difficult to anticipate that preemptively casting Resistance is just not an efficient use of your time. You're much better off just casting Guidance, since at least that will be far more likely to yield an actual result. In combat, where saving throws are far more abundant, the spell is actually even more useless. Since it requires your action to cast and your concentration, you mostly lose the turn that you cast it on, and are then barred from using your concentration on another actually useful spell, in the hopes that at some point in the next 1 minute that an ally that you happen to target will be subjected to a saving throw. There's just no value here. Once again, the proposed fix found in UA3 for 1D&D gives Resistance the same treatment that it did Guidance. It changes the spell into a reaction that can be used in response to an ally within 10 feet of you failing a saving throw. It's a great and simple change that probably brings the spell much closer to its anticipated power level of being good in the right situation, but not utterly useless the remainder of the time. So far we've had spells that were too good and some spells that were not good enough, and the next one is a little bit different. It's something of a misleading spell. It borders on being a trap choice, but isn't quite there, since it isn't necessarily bad, but it just almost always is. It gets you by looking like it does so much, but the reality is that it just doesn't actually make a lot of sense. The cantrip that I'm talking about is Infestation. I'm gonna be honest here, I forgot that this spell existed prior to researching this video. I don't think I've ever really seen or heard anyone talking about it. It's never been cast during any of my games, and on the face of it, it doesn't actually seem terrible, but the more that you read it, the less sense that it makes. Infestation is available to bards, sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards. It costs 1 action to cast and takes effect instantaneously. It reads, you cause a cloud of mites, fleas, and other parasites to appear momentarily on one creature that you can see within range. The target must succeed on a Constitution saving throw, or it takes 1d6 poison damage and moves 5 feet in a random direction if it can move, and its speed is at least 5 feet. Roll a d4 for the direction. 1 north, 2 south, 3 east, 4 west. This movement doesn't provoke opportunity attacks, and if the direction rolled is blocked, the target doesn't move. The damage does also scale as per normal cantrip scaling. Like I mentioned earlier, it just seems that you're getting such a good amount out of the spell, but the reality is anything but. Firstly, it requires the target to make a Constitution saving throw, which is among the most succeeded on saves in the game, so it's immediately less likely to pass even the first hurdle. Secondly, the damage it deals is poison, which is probably, after fire damage, the most commonly resisted damage type in the game. Then you get forced movement, which is admittedly a really cool rider effect, but the problem is that it's just so unreliable and unpredictable to the point that it might not actually work at all if the roll direction happens to be blocked. The problem with Infestation isn't that it's necessarily bad, it's just got so many things working against it, from an unreliable save to a commonly resisted damage type to an inconsistent and unreliable rider effect. As a result, it just makes the spell so hard to actually choose, which is probably why no one ever talks about it. Since we just talked about a spell that is so close to being a trap spell, it's probably best that we now discuss the truest trap spell of them all, and that is of course True Strike. True Strike is available to bards, sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards. It costs 1 action to cast and also requires concentration. It reads, you point a finger at a target in range. Your magic grants you a brief insight into the target's defense. On your next turn, you gain advantage on your first attack roll against the target, provided that the spell hasn't ended. I'm not going to beat a dead horse about this one. We all know that this is abysmally awful. You're sacrificing the bulk of your turn to have a slightly increased chance at hitting the target on the next turn, assuming of course it's still alive. In almost every circumstance imaginable, it's better to not cast True Strike, as having 2 chances to hit a creature rather than an increased chance at 1 hit is going to just be better. What happened here, and Jeremy Crawford has stated this publicly, is that during the original design for 5th edition, the team heavily overvalued advantage. They were aware that it was a powerful new mechanic in the game, and it is mathematically very good, and they were so protective of it that some things like True Strike came from that worry. This spell isn't even worth the ink that it's printed on, and is probably the best example of a trap spell in all of 5th edition. What's kind of funny about True Strike though is that the proposed change that we got from the Bastions and Cantrips UA may have actually swung a little bit too far in the other direction, ironically making it still a poorly designed cantrip. The new version allows you to make an attack as part of the same action that you used to cast the spell, much like Green Flame Blade and Booming Blade. The thing is though, it also allows you to use your spellcasting ability modifier for attack and damage rolls rather than the strength or dexterity, and allows you to change the damage type to radiant damage. And it also scales, dealing additional radiant damage at each level breakpoint. With this, if a wizard has access to something like a hand crossbow, which is not very hard to gain proficiency in, the new True Strike effectively outclasses any other cantrip. I absolutely love the enthusiasm here in wanting to make True Strike usable, but I think some work still needs to be done to restrain that design a little bit. So far we've had cantrips that are too good, not good enough, some misleading ones, a trap spell, and the final one that I want to talk about is mostly a useless spell. I'm talking about Spare the Dying. Now I'll start off by saying that if you're a Grave Domain cleric, casting Spare the Dying from 30 feet and as a bonus action is pretty sweet, but most players aren't Grave Domain clerics, so instead this is mostly just a useless spell. Spare the Dying is available to clerics and artificers, costs 1 action to cast, and has a range of touch. It reads, you touch a living creature that has 0 hit points. The creature becomes stable. The spell has no effect on undead or constructs. So obviously the spell does something, it isn't actually entirely useless. The thing is though that it has an essentially identical effect to just rolling a 10 or higher on a medicine check, or just a single use from a healer's kit, which costs all of 5 gold pieces. So sure, there's a world where you fail your medicine check and you either don't have or have been deprived of your healer's kits, but if I were a cleric considering this spell, I would just instead opt to ensure that I always have at least a few healer's kits on me at any given time, and use this slot for something else that isn't so easily replicable by multiple other already existing mechanics in the game. It's also worth mentioning that the proposed revision of Spare the Dying does allow it to be used at range, which does call into question how the Grave Domain cleric is going to be revisited, but that all remains to be seen. I'll give a quick shout out to Control Flames and Create Bonfire as well, because they should honestly just be part of the same spell. Cantrips are truly a foundational element of the spellcaster's arsenal, and I think it's really important that they are designed to feel like real choices and not crowd out other spells or also just feel like traps. Design is a really tricky thing since it's not always about being too good or too bad, but instead what things feel like relative to each other, and that's what I find just so interesting about it. Let me know if you enjoyed this video. If so, I might do something similar for each spell level. Subscribe to help me reach 5,000 subs by the end of the month, consider joining my channel, and also check out some of my other D&D videos. But otherwise, take care.